and it's a real pleasure to be here. As Marion said, I'm a sociologist, and 20 years ago, I was on the National Economic and Social Forum when we did a study, a report on lone parenthood. And we'd actually got started on the project when somebody suddenly said, what about the dads? They'd been totally left out of the terms of reference. And I was in the very privileged position that I was asked then to go and find a cross-section of dads, of older dads and younger dads and married dads and never married dads who were not resident with their children. And we tried to look at the impact of that on their ability to develop and maintain a fathering role. And I'm delighted that some of the speakers today will actually be addressing that. And I'm so excited to find out what's happened in the last 20 years and what is the best practice internationally on engaging dads. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion this afternoon. I also want to congratulate Marion and her team at the outset. It's just, this webinar is just another brilliant initiative by CDI, who always remain attuned to the needs of families and children in particularly challenging contexts. So well done on organizing the seminar. Or webinar, excuse me, got to keep up with the lingo. Okay, so my job really is to try to keep the event rolling and to stick as closely as possible to the very tight timelines that you've already seen. So we're going to have, first of all, presentations from, well, we're going to have 6 presentations, 2 from international speakers and the other 4 are more locally based. And we'll start with the international speakers. They both have extensive biographies, but I'm actually going to just edit them down a little bit because I don't want to take up too much room. So the first 2 speakers who you're going to hear from, first of all, is Dr. Gary Barker, who's the CEO and founder of Pro Mundo. Gary is a developmental psychologist, and he is a leading global voice in engaging men and boys in advancing gender equality and positive masculinities, as well as being the founder of Pro Mundo, and he'll tell you a little bit about that work in his presentation. Gary is also the co-founder of Men Care, a campaign to promote men's involvement as caregivers, and co-founder of Men Engage, a global alliance of more than 700 NGOs. He has advised the UN, the World Bank, and lots of other national governments, as well as foundations and corporations on strategies to engage men and boys in promoting gender equality. Our second speaker will be Cassius Campbell, who's from the Fatherhood Institute in the UK. And Cassius has 20 years of experience working in the care sector. He's a trained counsellor and psychoanalytic consultant, and his work with the Institute includes keynote speaker, workshop facilitation, and project management. He has contributed to shaping national and local policy and practice to establish father-inclusive approaches in universal services in the UK. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Dr. Gary Barker to give his presentation on the science and practice of engaging fathers, lessons from Pro Mundo's international work. So over to you, Gary, and you have approximately 20 minutes to speak. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mary, for that introduction. And my slides up there, all of you can see them, I believe. Great. Thanks a lot for this introduction. It really is an honor to get to share some ideas with you. I realized in that bio I left off probably the most important part, which is that I am a father, have been raised and trained to be one by an amazing 22-year-old Brazilian-American daughter. And I think that's a very important part of my CV. I'm also son of a social worker who, together with my mother, adopted 2 other children apart from a biological child, and we had at least 4 foster children over the course of my childhood. So the role of men in the care of others, I really had no choice but to look at and be part of. The Pro Mundo's work comes out of work with young and adult men in low-income areas in Rio de Janeiro initially. I moved there to work on my PhD dissertation looking at young men and their trajectories in and out of gang activity. And it was clear in not too many days of interviews just how much the role or the absence of fathers and mothers filling in, and others, particularly aunts and grandmothers, filling in the second or the third parent or caregiver, how much those issues were so important, and became really clear as we did our work to promote healthy masculinities, how much caregiving, of course, is a part of that. So I want to talk about what we've been doing in these years of trying to build this, particularly in low-income countries and settings, both policy and program and built on research to engage men and support men's caregiving. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the big picture challenges and promises and of engaging men in the full hands-on work of being caregivers and fathers. Some ideas of some things that we've tried that I'm calling some big solutions buckets, and then to talk about some of the challenges and things that we think still need to be done. And I should emphasize that Promundo is we are now 5 offices in different parts of the world working with this common cause of engaging men as in gender equality, violence prevention, and involved fatherhood. About half of what we do is research. So our approaches are based in research, partnered, a lot of that partnered, some of it that we carry out ourselves. Our US office, where I'm based now, we're about 20 people, and then we've got probably about 80 people altogether across our 5 offices. Since 2015, we started carrying out because we thought there wasn't kind of a good research repository. Some of this has been inspired by groups like the Fatherhood Institute that you'll hear about in a few minutes as well, of bringing some information of what do we know, what does the data tell us about fathers. We did the first ever State of the World's Fathers in 2015, a huge review of what research was out there, some as our own, some certainly others, of what we knew about father participation. I think one, I'll just give a very, very highlights of those, but one is that 80% of the world's men, demographically we know, are or will be biological fathers. So this matters to a huge amount of men in the world, and certainly matters to households. Rather obvious to affirm that, but I think it is important. We think that all men have reasons to be connected and involved in the care of others. So just the sheer size of this issue is important. Many of you know the child development field is a field of study for many years really ignored fathers. We were, when I was raising or part of my daughter's entry into the world and doing my PhD in developmental psychology, it was clear just how little fathers were considered. When we were often absent. A lot of reason because men were doing and still are not doing our share of the hands-on care work, but often either absent in the mother-child dyad conversations and research, or we were problems in terms of our absence or in terms of violence or harm done in the household. And all those things, of course, do exist, but it's been longer or later in coming, a whole science of what we know about men's participation in care work. And the research is clear, I think, of what we do mean, and Michael Lamb and many others building this research field, is that while some fathers would like to think we matter because we do different things in a masculine way, what the research really says is that we matter like mothers. If we do hands-on care work, if we develop relationships of deep attachment and care, and we put our child's interest before our own, and we are a crazy about you parent or caregiver, we matter in children's lives. And then exciting, and I hope Cassius draws on this because I know the Fatherhood Institute has also promoted and gotten out a lot of this research. There's a lot of new research on the hormonal and the biological and the brain changes when we do care work, finding that, not surprisingly, men and women, whether we are biological parents or otherwise, we are epigenetically programmed to care. If we carry out hands-on care, our brain systems change, enabling us to use that human wiring that we have to attach and connect and focus our energy on the child or the other who needs our support, care, and hands-on caregiving. So it's fairly obvious that the big picture around research is that father involvement, if we do our share of the care, is positive for women's lives, it's positive for children's lives in almost every way that we measure it. It's positive for men ourselves. We live longer, we're healthier, we report greater happiness and fewer mental health problems when we report close attachments to our children. And we've got data that it's important for societies. There's research done by a colleague that we work with in Norway, Øystein Holter, finding that in countries where men do a greater share of hands-on care work, homicide rates are lower. And there's some other positive effects that we think are at least in part related to a caring version of manhood being more present than perhaps the opposite. So all that's to say, it matters, and that's why we're here, and that's why we're talking about it. And we use that data a lot to make the case to policymakers of why this matters. We've been doing several reports, and the third one came out in 2019, pulling together the data of where we are in terms of engaging men in care work. Many other country partners have carried out country versions of this to try to call attention to policymakers of why caregiving matters. So let's talk men's caregiving in particular. So what are some of the challenges there? I want to preface by saying often in the discourse in media and sometimes in social service agencies, there's often a discussion that it's a character flaw when men don't participate more as fathers, that if they're absent or not living in the household or not fully engaged in caregiving, that often it's kind of the individual man's fault. And a lot of our social services, of course, are focused on engaging individual men or in family settings. But I think it is important to acknowledge the bigger systems and structural challenges there that we think have to be addressed together with better and thoughtful program level approaches. So, when we ask why aren't men doing a greater share of this, one is that we look around the world, we still raise our sons to believe that manhood is mostly about being the provider. Even if you have biological or other children, most men, no matter where we look, see themselves as providers first, and caregiving comes next. And that is an issue that we need to think about. How do we raise our sons from early on to see ourselves as, yes, to be providers and co-breadwinners, if that's certainly fits within things that we need from adults in society, but to see ourselves as well as caregivers from early on, and to think about how we bring our sons and daughters up to see themselves in these dual roles, which is where we think the world is and should be. If we look at the other policy ones, certainly lots of debate, and I think Cassius may bring up as well, Fatherhood Institute's been part of conversations in the UK about parental leave. But if we think of, the single largest or obvious policy lever used around the world of parental leave, almost every country but 2 in the world has paid maternity leave. I will note shamefully that the US is one of those 2 that does not have paid guaranteed nationwide maternity leave or paternity leave. We're equally bad in our lack of leave for men and women. But around the world, if we look then in terms of paternity leave, less than half of the world's countries offer it. When it's available, it is usually less than 3 weeks, and most of the time 5 to 6 days. That does beg the question, do we actually believe that fathers' roles are very important? If the single largest policy lever we have doesn't really include men, we have to think about that. We have never advocated for taking days away from mothers. We think non-transferable, fully paid, equal leave for fathers, mothers, and all caregivers is the way to go in terms of parental leave policies, and have been advocating a lot on that. Even if we offer leave, and I think it is important to much of the discourse about low-income fathers in the US and some other settings has been about deadbeat dads, the kind of idea that they're lacking character, they're not doing their part. Even our progressive President Obama used the issue of kind of individual responsibility instead of looking at some of the structural issues. And we've seen similar discourses in Brazil and many other countries where we've partnered. The main reason, whether we look in middle income or upper income countries, of why men don't participate or take leave, the issue is often about financial stability. Even in wealthy countries, we worry about taking time off and how we'll be seen in the workplace, and if our income will suffer. And families continue to make decisions that mothers take time off of work because their incomes are typically lower, while fathers, in the context of a heterosexual household, continue working. Our jobs then, therefore, we earn more, we work more, we are drawn more away from the care work. So I think we definitely have to think about policies that both support leave as necessary, but also the financial stability of households. We've done reviews of social protection policies around the world, which are even more important during COVID, and found that with very good logic, they focus on giving cash support and other income and other in-kind services to households via the mother. Lots of good historical reasons for that. We did a review last year of 149 social protection policies in the Global South and found only 3 that had any mention of the need to engage men's involvement in caregiving and fatherhood. So again, in other income-related, poverty-related social programs, we continue to believe that fathers are absent or they don't matter. And have to ask the question, how then do we change this? The other thing we've been looking at is how media portrays and how we continue to raise boys that way. I'm just taking a look at time. I think I've got 6 minutes left. Is that right, Mary? A thumbs up, something like that. You'll tell me when I'm getting close to the end. We've also been looking at how the media looks at fathers and presents men in terms of caregiving roles. We did a study recently, this was done during COVID, when we know from research that children and young people, all of us, are spending more time online streaming. With the Gina Davis Institute, which has worked for years to look at women's and girls' presentation in media. And we looked at the television shows that boys ages 8 to 13 are watching. And we looked at that age range because it is the age range of girls and boys who are spending the most time watching television during COVID. And what we found, what we found is that overall, boys are seeing women and girls in situations of equality in terms of their visibility on screen, in terms of what boys are watching on television. This is an analysis of the 20 most watched shows of boys in the US, ages 8 to 13, and a review of 25 of the episodes of those 20 shows. So it's an analysis of 500 television shows. But what else did boys see? One, male characters are more likely to be seen working rather than caregiving. They're less likely to be shown than women as hands-on parents. And when they're shown as parents, they're less likely to be shown as competent parents. So again, while we see women in situations of visibility and in leadership, et cetera, we are not seeing what boys are watching on television does not show them all that many images of men as competent, connected caregivers. Solutions, let's talk about a few things in this time that's left. One is, and I think it's important to say, we think these solutions need to be from an ecological perspective. We need the laws and policies. We need to change the social norms around who does the caregiving. We must connect this as well in poverty alleviation and the economic security of households. We've got to think about this as couples and co-parents. This is not shifting from fathers to mothers. It's doing it together. And it's looking at ways that we support the individual caregiving of fathers, of individual men. I'll provide you with a link to the Men Care campaign. It's a platform now of 55 countries participating. Fatherhood Institute's been part of many of the global conversations we've had. It is bringing together some of the practice on the website. There's a lot of examples of father training and parent training, along with research and advocacy tools. We've been doing advocacy around parental leave and norm change. We also have a evidence-based parent training tool that we call Program P for Paternidade in Portuguese and Paternité in Spanish. It's been scaled up with ministries of health and early childhood in a few countries. Here's some examples of kind of faces of around the world of messaging around that have been on billboards and bus boards and in waiting rooms at ministries of health around the world. I'm going kind of fast here, but I can share these later. Our fatherhood training materials built on a lot of the best that's out there. Our main point of entry for doing this work in many countries has been prenatal visits. One of our lessons learned has been finding men where they are, and about 80% of the cases, men have accompanied women to prenatal visits. Many parts of the world, there's no services, conversation, even material available for men in such settings. So we've used that as the point of entry, and then use that as a recruitment of fathers into father groups where it's both fathers part of the time, mothers part of the time, the couples come together, and other times we've done randomized controlled trial level evaluations of this and found reductions in violence against women by men, reductions in violence against children, and increased participation by men in the daily care of children, as well as reduced couple conflict. Other measures we're looking at over a 3-year period of time to measure the impact in child development. We're doing that both in Lebanon and Rwanda. We've also done this in about another 10 or 12 countries. Moving to close, we're using the primary healthcare sector because in many countries, it is one of the most functioning, widest reaching services and a place we can sometimes find men, at least during this initial phase of being a parent and becoming a parent. And it is an opportunity to both promote health as well as engage him from the beginning, as well as to promote violence reduction. So we've been advising ministries of health in a number of countries and putting in place some fairly simple protocols as a result of our work. Brazil now has, via its primary healthcare system, what is called the prenatal health protocol for men, of engaging men both for their own health as well as engaging them as partners in maternal and child health. Finally, we've partnered a lot with the corporate sector to engage them to see the need to support all individuals, all workers in our caregiving needs and our caregiving supports. So we've created a global parental leave task force, but it's not only about leave, it's also about flex work policies and what corporations can do to be allies in this. Facebook, Twitter, Bank of America, KPMG, Unilever, many others part of that. So finally, what I want to leave the message is, we also like to promote just how much involved fatherhood pays forward. Research that we've done in 45 countries shows that if men are involved in the care of their children early on, their sons are 1.5 times more likely to do that in the future, and their daughters are more likely to believe in and support and promote their own empowerment and equality in the world. This work pays forward, and we're thrilled to be able to contribute to these conversations about it, and both to support men in what we see as good for us, but also to help amplify just kind of the multiplier effects that involved parenthood and co-parenthood we believe has. Let me stop there, and thanks.
Thank you so much, Gary. I mean, you actually brought us on a whistle-stop tour of the world. It truly was a global presentation. And the other thing I think was brilliant about it was the way in which everything you said was evidence-based, because that's a hugely important principle of all of the work that CDI does as well. So thank you so much for that, Gary. Okay, I've already introduced our second speaker, Cassius Campbell from the Fathers Institute in London. And Cassius's title of his paper is Bringing Fathers In. So over to you, Cassius, and
Fantastic.
20 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gary. It's a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much, Gary. It's really good to have you there, so I can just roll into what you've just said and lead on from there. Can I just want to thank you, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here today to do this presentation and to be part of this wonderful event. I just want to pick up on something that Gary said earlier on around when boys see their fathers doing caregiving, then it makes them more able to be caregivers. And I really want to reiterate that and say that's a really powerful statement, and it's true. I'm from a family of 4 boys, and I'm the 3rd youngest. And seeing my father doing washing, cleaning, ironing, hoovering, and to be able to be actually involved in that was definitely a firm foundation for me when I then became a parent myself, because there was no obstacle. Everything was just open in order for me to do that for my own children. And it's a powerful metaphor, I think, that will continue throughout, definitely in my presentation today. Okay, Rebecca, could we go to the next slide, please? So I've come from an organisation called the Fatherhood Institute, and what we do 4 main things, and we do research, we do policy, we do practice, and then we do direct work. At the moment, we're working in collaboration with the Nuffield Foundation, and we're doing a lot of longitudinal study research around fatherhood, where's the daddy, work-life balance, who's the bloke in the room, and those research, and also around COVID-19, which is impacting on all of us at this present moment in time. And we're really pleased about that, because it's actually bringing to light the gaps that exist within our services, and also to look at how those gaps can be filled in order to ensure that fathers are able to have a full and extensive involvement in their child's pre and post birth, and also in regards to the child's upbringing as well, to make sure that they're acknowledged as being an important part of that. We also do work around policy, and that's engaging government. We're very influential in regards in the UK in regards to getting parental leave for fathers, but there's still a long way to go in regards to how we can progress that forward. In regards to practice, we do a lot of training, consultancy, and resources. And I suppose I'm hoping that after the session today, you'll be able to see a bit more about what we do. We also do direct work with mothers and fathers, especially around maternity services, health visiting, community services, schools, nurseries, and workplace settings. So the questions that I have for you as the audience is about the percentages. What percentage of parents are in a couple relationship at the time of the birth? So, and these discussions can continue in the breakout rooms afterwards. So, here are the answers for you. 85% of couples state they are married or cohabiting at the time of the birth of their child. 5% state that they're not cohabiting, but self-define as being a couple, so being together. 5% state that they're just good friends. And 5% state that they're not in a relationship. So if we look at the statistics and the percentages of that, we can deduce that 95% of fathers are present in the lives of their children. And I suppose this is significant when we think about some of the concerns that we see when we go when we engage with early years services, and they say, well, fathers aren't around, fathers aren't present, fathers are hard to reach. But based on our statistics and our research, fathers are very much there, they're present, they're available, but it's about how that is done. And if fathers aren't seen as being a helpful resource, then they're seen as the opposite of that, which is just an add-on, which I think then alienates fathers from the whole process. So can you just bear that in mind around the 95% of fathers who are around? I'll go to the next slide. So what percentage of families attending children's centres are lone parent families? And number two, in what percentage of these families are fathers engaging with their children? So bearing in mind the previous slide talked about 95% of fathers are still around. So this is a research we did around evaluation of children's centres in England. And those parents who said they were lone parent households comprised of 19%. And this was based on children's centres registration process. 77% of mothers said that the child was in contact with their birth parents. 25% say other parent sees the child every day. So if we look at the bottom 25% and we take that away from the 90% on the top, we still have a figure of around 96% of fathers who see their children regularly, and only 5 to 4% of children who don't see their fathers. So again, it links in with our previous research around that fathers are there, fathers are present, fathers are willing to engage, but the fact is they're not being engaged, and they're not being engaged enough. So questions that we ask around percentages of mothers who are in a relationship with the father at the time of the birth. So 1 in 4 dads attends the birth. 1 in 3 dads are still in touch with the mother and infant 9 months later. 78% of the babies born to teenage mothers are jointly registered by both parents together, and that's really significant. Among young fathers, most are very involved at the time of the birth. The fact is, where they lose contact is over time, and it's either they're excluded or they don't get on with the mother of their child's parents, mainly the mother of the child. And that happens in a stage of maybe 2 to 3, over a stage of 2 to 3 years. Around 1 in 10 mothers present as a single parent, but usually the father is either living close by or she may even be living with the father of her child. And one of the reasons behind this is around the benefit system in the UK. I suppose our country tends to reward mothers when they're separated rather than mothers when they're in a couple relationship and in a collective family unit. So when we think about 21st century dads, fathers and children's attainment, fathers are so important because they have an impact on children's health and well-being, on children's mental health, on children's diet and nutrition, on children's education, and a highly involved father who has expectations for their child and their child's achievement, the child will do better and have better educational outcomes. And this will outweigh all other areas of socio-economic deprivation. When a father is highly involved in their children's education, highly involved in engaging in the school and with their child's teacher, it's more likely that their child will have a better educational outcome. The opposite of that is also true. Low interest of fathers in their child's education will have a strong negative impact and reduces a child's chance of escaping poverty by 25%. And I just say that a lot of this material that I'm delivering today is very much on our website, so please feel free to sign up to the Fatherhood Institute website, and I'll give you the details at the end of this presentation. So a question that normally comes up is, can dads do it? Can dads care as well as mothers care? And to be honest with you, dads can do it. Fathers and mothers' stroking touch is equally effective in calming babies. Fathers' responsiveness varies depending on the degree of responsibility of care they are given. So basically, the more care and responsibility fathers are given around the caring of their child from birth, the more actively involved they will be right throughout the child's upbringing. And that's really important, because what tends to happen is fathers become de-skilled, and they become de-skilled from a very early stage. And what we have here is we have a golden moment, and the golden moment is in the perinatal stage, where that is the time when you really need to engage fathers and tell them how important they are to their children, how important they are to their wives or their partners, and how important they are to the whole collective of this new family that's being formed. There is no biological based differences between the sexes in regards to sensitivity to infants. So we look at neurobiological factors and how they impact on fathers when they become a father for the first time. Well, there's a reducement in regards to testosterone. There's an increase in hormones that facilitate responsiveness to infants, vasopressin, closeness and care, prolactin, affection and social bonds, oxytocin. And when we think about the brain, the neuroplasticity of the brain and the changing that happens from a biological perspective, this happens for fathers when they actually engage with a newborn baby. And when we talk about the skin-to-skin contact, that's really crucial in regards to forming that father-child bond. And that happens at the very earliest stage, even from the perinatal stage right through to birth. So there's this sense around sex differences in parenting capacity. Do mothers do it? Are mothers born to do this? Do mothers do this better than fathers? When? Well, the fact is, if both mother and father are similarly supported and developed in regards to childcare skills, then they develop at the same rate. Their engagement, their knowledge, their skill set, their ability around caring for a newborn baby is at the same stage. But unfortunately, what happens, because all the interventions, all the energy, all the productivity, all the time is given to the mother, then what happens for the father is he becomes left out from that process. And his stage of development then is very much reduced in regards to that of the mother. So what are some of the barriers that prevent father engagement? So I invite you to look at the slide, and I think when we think about health visitors, when we think about midwives, when we think about early years in general, it's very much based on this triangular system where it's the child, the mother, and the worker, the practitioner. And I suppose what's missing from this systemic or traditional systemic makeup is, where is the father? Where is the father in this dynamic? Where is the father in this holistic period of time when it's important for him to acknowledge, to take up his role as a father within this dynamic. And it's more likely that the father is left out of this dynamic. And this is what needs to change. So why does this matter? So as I said earlier on, fathers' limited opportunity to learn about caring for their new baby because of systems that have been set up for mothers as the conduit for information leaves fathers absent from this process. And the marginalization of fathers presents three main problems. And number one, it suggests that fathers are optional in children's lives and don't contribute to children's well-being. Number two, it is detrimental to mothers as it overburdens them with sole responsibility rather than the shared responsibility. And number three, it dissuades take-up of and participation in services by fathers, and it pushes men to accept a diminished role in the life of their families, and that needs to change. So when we think about practice, here's a couple of case studies, and these are really simple things that can be done to change practice within the settings that probably where some of you as the audience actually work. So we had two health visitors who worked in the health centre in Lincolnshire, in Grantham, and they did two particular studies. They sent out letters which headed with the heading saying, "Dear Parents," and they sent out another letter with the heading, "Dear Father and Mother," or "Dear Mum and Dad," new Mum and Dad. And it was to an event at the health centre. And what they discovered was the letters where they sent out "Dear Parents," only 3 fathers turned up. But when they sent out letters saying "Dear new Mum and Dad," 11 of 16 dads attended the event at the health centre. And that's really significant, because if you invite dads specifically, if you make it an expectation, then it's more likely that dads will attend those events. If you do not make it an expectation, then dads will not bother. And when we say parents, what we really mean by the word parent, we mean mother. So we need to be specific. We need to say the F word. We need to make sure that father is included in those documents, if and when necessary, and if it's safe to do so. The only reason where I would reconsider that is if the father is a Schedule 1 offender, then possibly other things will need to be arranged in order to accommodate that situation. There's also the Penn Green Research Centre, which is in Corby, Northamptonshire. It's the leading centre in the early years sector. And what they discovered was they weren't getting a lot of fathers coming into their events that they organised at their centre. So what they decided to do, they set up a video at the reception area of when mothers and dads will bring their children into the centre. And what they discovered was the staff, when mothers brought the children in to the centre, the staff would be really engaging with the mothers, asking how their day was, asking how the child was, asking if everything was okay, and there would be really good dialogue. But alternatively, when the dads brought in the same children, it was take the coat, goodbye dad, and they brought the child in. There was no discussion, there was no engagement. And as a direct result of the video, they were able to learn about how better to engage fathers and to actually make sure they have those conversations about how are you, dad? What was it like at the birth? How are you feeling? How are things today? Those things are really crucial. The way how fathers are received into an organisation determines whether they will return. So again, make father inclusion in attendance an expectation and not an afterthought. Can you tell me how many minutes have I got left?
I just do a little chat to say 3 minutes.
3 minutes, okay, I'm nearly there, great. So based on the earlier triangle that I introduced earlier on in an earlier slide, this is what we call father inclusive working behaviour. So we have everyone involved here. We have the child, we have the father, we have the mother, and we have the staff The health services at the center of that, really engaging collectively with all sources that are involved in the collectiveness of this family. And this is where you get good enough outcomes. But I suppose the question that needs to be asked is, what might this feel like for the practitioner? Because they have to hold in mind, not only the child, but they also hold in mind the mother and the father and how they can make this dynamic work. But this is the way forward, and this is the way how I'd like to believe things need to be done in order to make sure father inclusive practice is effective. So I'm gonna put out a couple of tips here.
That's wonderful, Cassius. Thank you so much. I'm actually incredibly impressed by the way in which both speakers have really stuck to the time limit. I found your presentation fascinating, especially, you know, your slide where you talked about how responsiveness increases the more responsibility is given to a young man. And of course, you know, the counter argument that you also, or the counter position that responsibility diminishes the father's role. So that you really clarified that and brought it out so well, and how important it is to affirm and empower the young dads. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, folks, so we have about 10 minutes for questions, and Marion has been gathering up some of the comments, and we have a couple of questions which I will pose on behalf of all of us. Actually, maybe if I just stick with you, Cassius, for a minute, and then I'll pose one to Gary. What, you know, in your own experience, and it was very experiential, your presentation, I felt, what particular structural or policy initiative has been most effective in your experience and practice in enabling this process of father engagement? I mean, is there anything that you can pick out? Obviously, you gave us the example of you know, engaging the dads by simply addressing them on letters, but is there anything else that you think of that really stands out?
Well, I think what's important is systemic change, and that's what needs to happen. Right. And as I look at the participants in this particular webinar, you know, it's not unusual to see an overwhelming female presence, because it is a female-dominated industry. And I think for those of you who have male colleagues who work within your centre, I think it's about how do you look after those male colleagues and how do you build on that existing good practice. And I think it's about changing systems, changing policies, and it doesn't have to be a big change, but it needs to be insightful, it needs to be mindful, in order to ensure that when fathers do come in seeking support, seeking guidance, seeking help, that it doesn't necessarily have to be a man who's there, but there's a member of staff there who can work with them effectively. And there's no gender bias available that will prevent that man from engaging. And I think that's the key, really. It's about policy change, systemic change. And that needs to happen in those particular places where the work takes place.
Great. Okay. I've just been asked that if people could use the hashtag engaging dads when they're posting about the webinar on social media, that would be greatly appreciated by CDI. Okay, I'm going to come back to you in a minute, Cassius, because people are asking about your key tips, but I just want to put a question to Gary. Gary, your presentation really, as we said, you know, swept around the globe. And just in terms of your experience of different geographies and ethnic groups that enable parental engagement in caregiving, you know, are there differences between groups in terms of their model of engagement? And if so, how do we learn from that here in Ireland? If different cultural contexts really matter for parental engagement?
Yeah, I mean, you know, in much of the world, we focus much more on the nuclear family. So, you know, the smaller, well, often heterosexual of, you know, mom, dad, and kids. Many of us that we work in caregiving has historically and contextually often been about many parents, about many caregivers. And so I think, you know, thinking beyond just the in the context of a, a heterosexual household of the mother-father triad, how do we think to I think broader systems of who cares for children, I think becomes really important. In some parts of the world there's social sanctions, let's say, on things that men aren't supposed to do. Some cultures think men shouldn't touch babies until they're about 1 year old and can fend for themselves, believing that men don't necessarily bring positive things there. But there's lots of other roles that brothers and uncles and later that fathers are seen important. So I think, the important thing is not to look at any of these as they've got it wrong, but where can we find ways that male involvement in the care of others and the care of children is already present, and how can we build on it? A lot of our work has, kind of questioned some of the ideas that said, well, men aren't doing their share, they're not here. And we said, well, give us a chance, let us look. And we will, use as part of storytelling films, giving examples of where men are doing that care. And using those stories to build on. So there is not a cultural tradition that we've worked with anywhere that doesn't have some involvement of men in the lives of children. And yes, some of those can be harmful and kind of patriarchal and based on power and hierarchy, but many are based on concern and care, and your model is the moral force, et cetera. So we think we can both question some of the harmful sides of that, but really build on the positive pieces that are there. And I think it's about flipping our kind of deficit perspective that's often there, that men are bringers of harm, or we're absent, or we're not important, flipping that around and finding all the ways that, in fact, every cultural setting has something that holds upon men's involvement in care. So yeah, I think there are lots of different pathways, but it's about not going in with a deficit perspective.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's really helpful, especially in the Irish context, because of course we have been sort of coming out from under a very patriarchal, religiously controlled culture, which is actually, as you say, we should look at it as an opportunity to rethink models of masculinity and models of fatherhood. Thanks very much, Gary. Cassius, there's been a bit of a clamor in the chat to hear your tips, your key tips, please.
Yeah, do you want to bring them back?
Yeah. Yeah, people just said they would really like to hear them. So if you could maybe just, because we do have a couple of, we have 6 minutes left.
Sorry.
Okay.
The top tips.
Yes.
Start from the
top tips from Cassius.
Yeah.
Yep.
To engage with men because you know that they're important to the child. And I just want to focus your attention on the bottom one, actually, the bottom tip, which is challenge fathers who disengage and reinforce how important they are in the lives of their children. And I suppose it's by getting the information that you need that you can then pass on to dads, because a lot of dads don't know this. A lot of dads don't know how important they are. A lot of dads don't know about neuroplasticity and the changing of the hormones and the oxytocin when their children are born. They know it happened, but they don't know the biology behind it. And those things are really important. Routinely gather the father's details on your child and family registration form. That's a safeguarding issue in itself. So that should be a given, that you're collecting new data in regards to when you meet a dad or a stepdad or a father figure. It's essential. Set up at meetings where you know that both mum and dad can be in attendance if it's safe to do so. So Mary, do you want to continue to the next slides and finish off? Or
yeah, if you have a minute if you want. Yeah, I just go ahead.
I'll do this really quickly. So these are the voices of children from a program that we run in schools called Fred, Fathers Reading Every Day. And it's just fantastic because when we do evaluations, we just don't do evaluations of mums and dads. We also do evaluations of children as well. We want to know what they think. And these are some of the voices of those children. And as you can see, it's great. And I particularly like this one. When we read Goodnight Tiptoe, I was tiptoe and Daddy was all others. These things are so important. And also fathers' voices. I enjoyed reading with Fred. Everyone should do it. It was fun. I feel that Fred project has benefited me in reading a lot more to my child, to help them, and it helped with my confidence in reading a bit more. And, you know, these are some of the trainings we do. Fred, which is Father's Reading Every Day, which is a reading for pleasure program that we do in early year settings as well as in primary schools. We also have Hit the Ground Crawling, which is a peer-to-peer support group for new dads and expectant dads, where they give each other advice and support. We also have Family Foundations, which is about couples who are about to start a family, and things that they need to do to communicate and have those conversations about how they're going to bring up their child together, to make sure that's a consistent and holistic approach.
Great, thank you. Yeah,
right.
Thanks very much, Cassius. There was one other question I just wanted to put to Gary that someone mentioned in the chat. Gary, you mentioned the dominance of the good provider role, the breadwinner role in a number of different countries, and people were asking whether, how is that different in Europe, for example, and is there a big difference between Europe and the countries in which you do the work?
Yeah, for sure. In terms of Europe and North America, Australia, urban Latin America, huge interest of women in the workplace and working in the paid workforce nearly as much as men. So, clearly in some parts of the world, this do I have a co-role of seeing myself both as a provider and a caregiver? That seems to be, particularly in a younger generation that we call millennials, that seems to be much more normal. Although, let's think about, so when I was a part-time stay-at-home father, when my daughter was born, data from the US was that about 40% of households at that point in the US, late 90s, aspired for equal caregiving at home. And probably 10% of households actually achieved it. More recent data in the US, more than 80% of younger couples aspire to equality, heterosexual couples aspire to equality of who does the care work. Only about a third of them are able to achieve it. So, even if we have greater aspirations of equality in the hands-on care work in the North and in Europe and North America and Australia, whether we achieve it or not is still a big question mark. And I don't see all women's faces in the room here, but I'm absolutely sure that you're nodding your head. So whether we look at what we call the mental load or simply the hands-on care work, in no country in the world, even with all the Scandinavian advances in parental leave and the like, are men doing the equal amount of hands-on care work on average. In many households, there's men who are doing our share. And in some cases, men doing more, women doing less. But in terms of averages, no place on earth has achieved that men are doing an equal amount on average of the daily care of children and others. So yeah, we've all got more to do, but I think rather than sort of just calling men out of, hey, we're not doing our share, is the issue of saying, what's the world around us? Workplace, school, the cues we received. Did we see this growing up? And Cassius shared that about what he observed. All those things have to go into getting men to make this normal. What we'd like to get to is in some amount of years, of course, men are doing our share of it because the rest of the world simply expects it and we make it possible.
Great. Okay, thank you. And I think both of you really made that point very well about the need for systemic change. Okay, guys, we're at 3 o'clock. I just want to mention that we will be able to circulate slides that are shared with us by the speakers later. And just to remind you to use the hashtag #EngagingDads if you're posting anything about this webinar. I can tell from the chat comments that people are incredibly grateful and have really enjoyed both Cassius and Gary's presentation. So on behalf of all of you, I'd like to thank both of them for their contribution this afternoon. We're going to take a 20-minute, as the Americans would say, comfort break. And that will allow us just to get a cup of tea or whatever, and then we'll reconvene at 3:20 to continue with the more kind of local dimension to this issue by looking at work that's going on in Ireland. So if you would just stay on line, i.e. mute yourself and stop your video, but don't actually take yourself out because it might be a bit difficult to get back into the call. So we're all going to take a break at this point, and we'll see you back at 3:20. Okay, thank you very much to everybody for so far.